We begin the day unable to say that the threat of war in eastern Ukraine has passed. Earlier today, Russia announced that it was pulling back some of its forces near the Ukrainian border and sending them back to their barracks. At first, it seemed to be a tentative sign of de-escalation, coming exactly when U.S. and European intelligence have been warning that Russia is now ready to launch a military strike on Ukraine. Let's pull in the map here. It tells a story of anything but de-escalation. Over the past few months, the Russian military has positioned more than 100,000 troops, you see right there, along the eastern and the southern border with Ukraine. Ukraine's northern border with Belarus, you see right there, it has now about 30,000 Russian troops in position. The Pentagon says eastern Ukraine is almost surrounded and is the obvious target for an overwhelming military invasion. The head of NATO today warned that shuffling around troops while leaving weapons in place is not a sign of de-escalation.
There are signs from Moscow that diplomacy should continue. This gives grounds for cautious optimism. But so far, we have not seen any sign of de-escalation on the ground. Russia has amassed a fighting force in and around Ukraine, unprecedented since the Cold War. Everything is now in place for a new attack. But Russia still has time to step back from the brink, stop preparing for war, and start working for a peaceful solution.
My first guest tonight says there is a solution to this crisis, and it involves a moratorium on NATO expansion. Thomas Graham was Senior Director for Russia on the National Security Council and Special Assistant to former President George W. Bush. He is now with the Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Graham, it's good to have you on the program.
Good to be here.
You write that a moratorium on NATO's eastward expansion for 20 to 25 years could be the answer to ending the impasse that we are in right now. Why isn't that idea gaining any traction?
Well, I think it has become part of the public debate, certainly in Europe, but to some extent in the United States and even in Russia. I note that the German reporter asked a question at the press conference between the Chancellor and President Putin today as to whether a moratorium was a possibility. Now, neither man answered the question, but I think that's evidence that it is part of the public debate.
Today, the German Chancellor said that Ukraine's membership in NATO is not on the agenda, and he said it will not be on the agenda while he and Vladimir Putin are in office. Now, Scholz is speaking to what many diplomats say, that former Soviet republics, including Ukraine, are still years away from being ready for NATO membership. Am I reading that right?
Absolutely. And I think that almost any NATO official and any U.S. official would say the same thing. We're not talking about any near-term membership by any countries of the former Soviet space. And so I think that really is off the table for an extended period. And I do believe that some agreement on that and how long that period is going to be part of the final solution. The diplomatic question is how you're going to formulate that to the satisfaction of Moscow, Brussels, and Washington.
And all of this is assuming that NATO will exist in its current form in 20 to 50 years from now. I mean, that assumption, though, it comes with some pitfalls, doesn't it?
Well, certainly. Nobody knows what the future is going to be like. And that's one of the reasons why an agreement on a moratorium might eventually find approval from Moscow. Who knows what's going to happen in 20, 25 years? But I do think that we will see significant transformation in NATO under any circumstances. The world has changed. The interest of European allies has changed. The United States has to focus on East Asia as well. So we will see transformation in the way NATO functions, if indeed NATO continues to exist over the very long term.
Let's talk about the past for just a moment. 15 years ago at the Munich Security Conference, Vladimir Putin lashed out at the U.S. and NATO for expanding eastward. Take a listen to a clip of what he said.
One state, and of course first and foremost the United States, has overstepped its national borders in every way. This is visible in the economic, political, cultural and humanitarian policies it imposes on other nations. Well, who would like that? Who could be happy about it?
Mr. Graham, what was the thinking inside the White House and at the National Security Council at the time? Was Vladimir Putin, was he not taken seriously?
Well, I think that in the White House at that time, they understood that Russia and President Putin himself personally were dissatisfied with NATO expansion. But NATO had already gone through two rounds in the late 1990s and in 2004. And the sense was that, like it or not, that Russia really was too weak to prevent the United States and NATO from moving forward if that's what they decided to do. And that would be offered, that would be able at the end of the day to offer enough concessions or symbolic steps to Putin so that he would accept NATO's expansion eastward.
Now, if we bring it back to the present, let me get your read on this. How close do you think we are right now to seeing a military invasion of eastern Ukraine?
I don't think that we're close at all. I think it's clear that Russia has put in place the forces that it needs for a military invasion. But every American official, a NATO official, says that the political decision has been made. I don't see a political decision being made in the near future to do that. The risks are tremendous. Putin, I think, is engaged in a war of nerves at this point. He will ratchet up the tension, ratchet it down, in the hopes that that will lead to some concessions on the Western side and on the part of Ukraine.
Putin has said that the Russian Duma has backed a resolution to recognize the rebel-controlled areas of eastern Ukraine as independent. Do you think that that is going to happen? I mean, wouldn't that throw a wrench in all of this diplomacy?
No, not at all. I think, again, this is part of the war of nerves at this point, putting another sort of tool into Putin's pocket that he can use to put pressure on Ukraine. But if he were to recognize the independence of these separatist republics, then in fact he sacrificed one of the things that he wants over the long term, and that is autonomous regions inside Ukraine that are loyal to Russia, that he can use to impact on both the domestic politics and the foreign policy of an independent Ukraine.
Thomas Graham with the Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Graham, we appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Valuable context in this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, after Emmanuel Macron and Boris Johnson, the latest European leader to visit Moscow was German Chancellor Olaf Scholz today. And if his host opts for an invasion of Ukraine, he could be the last to visit for quite some time for the foreseeable future. Scholz shares the same goal as his French and British counterparts, to stop a war in Europe. He came to Moscow with a warning that any attack on Ukraine would result in immediate and hard-hitting sanctions. Was President Vladimir Putin, was he listening?
The diplomatic options are far from exhausted. The task now must be to work resolutely and courageously towards a peaceful resolution of this crisis.
We view the deterrence of Russia by force as a direct and immediate threat to our national security, which the legal agreements based on our drafts are designed to remove.
For us Germans and for all Europeans, it is clear that lasting security cannot be achieved against Russia, only with Russia. We all agree on this in NATO and in the European Union, so it should be possible to find a solution.
I repeat, the answers to our proposed security guarantees given to us by the United States and NATO do not address the fundamental Russian demands.
Well, earlier this month, the Kremlin shut down the Russian operations of this channel, Deutsche Welle. Our Moscow bureau was closed and our journalist accreditations revoked. It was seen as retaliation for German media regulators banning the German language programming of the Russian state-backed broadcaster known as RT. Despite the ban, our chief political editor, Michaela Kufner, she traveled with the German chancellor to Moscow today. During the joint press conference between Putin and Scholz, Michaela posed the first question.
The question that all Europeans are asking is whether, despite the close ties with Russia, there will be another war in Europe. Can you, in this moment, rule out the possibility of war?
Jetzt im Augenblick Krieg aus. Will you rule out a war in Europe?
Do we want war? Of course we don't. That is exactly why we put forward proposals to open negotiations.
The first question there from DW. We are certain that President Putin got the message. DW continues to hope that its Moscow bureau will be allowed to reopen sooner rather than later. Well, earlier, we spoke with our chief political editor, Michaela Kufner. She is traveling with Chancellor Scholz.
Well, it appears that there wasn't necessarily a deep discussion about it, but it certainly is a sign, and it would make it much more difficult to now go into a full offensive just 24 hours later. It would be mixed signals also to a Russian public, because let's not forget that Vladimir Putin is speaking to Russians when he is in an international press conference like that. We also heard talk from the Defense Ministry that some of the objectives of those maneuvers, as it was called, were met, so that would allow for that step. At the same time, a stern warning from Vladimir Putin, who said he didn't want war either, that he, yes, he would still engage in further talks. At the same time, he would not allow it to happen that things get changed, which are then difficult to alter for the Russian side. So he won't see those dragged out, as he put it. So a bit of time bought through diplomacy for now, with still very uncertain map ahead.
That was Michaela Kufner there in Moscow.